Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Today we continue to get perspectives concerning the war in Ukraine. My guest today is an old friend of this radio program, Dr. Gerald Horne. Gerald Horne holds the Morris Professorship of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's the author of dozens of books, and he has a piece out at the Black Agenda Report called From Crisis to Catastrophe, What is to be Done in Eastern Europe. Gerald Horne, great pleasure, sir, to welcome you back to this radio program.
Thank you for inviting me.
There's a long history behind U.S.-Russian relations that you think is worth diving into when we think about what's happening in Ukraine today. How far would you go back?
Well, you at least have to go back to Tsarist times. You have to go back to the period before 1917. That is to say, the period before the Bolshevik Revolution, the Russian Revolution. Because as I suggest in that piece you so kindly mentioned at Black Agenda Report, I think in order to really understand the crisis today, you have to understand the roots and the continuities that link Tsarist Russia with the Soviet experience, 1917 to 1991, to the post-Soviet experience, 1991 to 2022. What I mean concisely is this. If you look at your map, it will quickly become obvious that the largest territory on the European continent is that of Russia. It has a population almost twice the size of the number two nation, speaking of the Federal Republic of Germany, which has a population of about 81 million. And if you look at the natural resources of Europe, they're disproportionately sited on Russian soil. Speaking of natural gas, oil, gold, titanium, which is necessary for building sophisticated airplanes, et cetera. So the major contradiction of European politics and history, going back to Tsarist times, is that as the Western European nations became fat from the plundering and pillaging of the Americas and Africa and the African slave trade, speaking of Britain and France in the first instance, they were not necessarily the dominant power in their backyard, speaking of the European continent. And as you know, there is a lengthy geopolitical literature concerning that whoever wants to dominate the world has to dominate this great landmass stretching today from Lisbon on the west to Vladivostok on the Pacific, speaking of the Russian city. And so what happens is that 200 years ago plus, Napoleon Bonaparte of France tries to resolve that contradiction by invading Russia. We all know what happens. We also know that a few
Just to be clear, it didn't go well for Napoleon, just in case. Just in case somebody didn't know.
Okay. It didn't go well at all, to put it mildly and euphemistically. Then a few decades later, there was the so-called Crimea conflict, when in the 1850s, London, Paris, and the sick man of Europe, speaking of Ottoman Turkey, gang up on Russia. That went a mite better, but it did not go better in the long term, because by 1904, you see London financing Japan in its attack on Russia, which was a turning point in world history, according to W.E.B. Du Bois, Nehru of India, Ho Chi Minh of Vietnam, Sun Yat-sen of China, insofar as it involved an Asian nation, speaking of Japan, inflicting a mighty blow on a European nation, which seemed to go against the dictates and presuppositions of white supremacy. But that attack on Russia leads directly to the Bolshevik Revolution. And then, of course, it helps to strengthen Japan, which it delivers a devastating knockout blow to the British Empire by 1941-42 by seizing its cash cows, speaking of Hong Kong and Singapore. And the British Empire was in terminal decline after those particular events. Now, what's remarkable is that Russia was not necessarily standing still as all of these events were unfolding. Even the New York Times mentioned a few days ago, and I have to say I was shocked to read it, when they were trying to explain why in the global South, there's not necessarily unanimity with regard to boycott, divestment, and sanctions of Russia, they mentioned something that I was stunned to read, which is that in another turning point with regard to anti-colonial struggle, speaking of the Italian invasion of what is now Ethiopia, then Abyssinia in the 1890s, where the Italians too were defeated. Now, I pointed out in my work that the Abyssinians, the Africans, were armed to the teeth by Russia. The New York Times mentioned that there were actually Russian volunteers on the ground fighting alongside their Abyssinian comrades at the time. Now, there's continuity insofar as Moscow, or Russia, I should say more accurately, found it useful to weaken its Western European adversaries by seeking to weaken them at the foundation of their wealth, which was colonialism. And that particular continuity you see stretching not only from the 1890s during Tsarist times, obviously it manifests during Soviet times. We all know, I assume, that in terms of the liberation of Southern Africa from the 1970s to the 1990s with the election of Nelson Mandela and the first democratic elections in South Africa in 1994, the Africans were armed to the teeth by Moscow, oftentimes in league with their Cuban allies and comrades who inflicted the most devastating blows on the apartheid military. And so what you see being worked out now to a certain degree is this continuing conflict between the North Atlantic countries, now led by the United States, and Russia. And I'm not so sure if this contradiction will necessarily be resolved with regard to this present crisis, although it is useful to mention that protestations to the contrary by the US media notwithstanding, there's not necessarily global unity with regard to this boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement against Russia. We all saw the vote at the General Assembly, where you had about 36 abstentions, with African nations being disproportionately represented, including Zimbabwe, South Africa, Namibia, Senegal, Algeria, etc. And then, of course, there are the abstentions by South Asian nations, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, etc. And what's remarkable there, once again, is that there has been a long-standing tie between India, en route to being the most populous nation on planet Earth, and Moscow. It not only stems from the post-1947 independence, but even before then, under this premise of weakening colonialism, the major antagonist of Russia, and then the Soviet Union at its root. And you see now that with this boycott on Russian energy, which has been inaugurated by Mr. Biden, we see now that New Delhi is negotiating with Russia to purchase this energy on the cheap, which will probably go through, which then leads to this other point with regard to why it is in the global South there is a kind of reluctance to go along with BDS vis-a-vis Russia. First of all, there is the hypocrisy. That is to say that Washington exceeded a United Nations mandate by engaging in regime change in Libya, had no UN mandate to go into Iraq in 2003. And yet there's been this remarkable BDS movement attaining liftoff with regard to Ukraine. And many in the global South are wondering if there's a double standard at play that we're all going to have to be subject to. That is to say, the United States and its allies can invade and overthrow willy-nilly, and only they can do that. And then, of course, there's the point that there's a lot of upset, understandably, and I would say also amongst Black Americans as well, with regard to how African refugees have been maltreated and mistreated. There's a front page story in the New York Times just this morning, juxtaposing how a Sudanese refugee on the Ukraine-Polish border has been abused, harassed, etc. You might have seen the statement from the African Union reprimanding the Ukrainian government and the Polish government for this maltreatment. The statement by President Buhari of Nigeria. There are thousands and thousands, or there had been thousands of us African students matriculating in Ukraine, and now many of them have gone, and many of them barely escaping with their lives intact.
Gerald Horne, there's a lot you laid out there, and some of it I want to dive into more with you. But first, let me then ask you, after laying all of that out, and of course, most people, especially listening to this show, know about NATO expansion and the controversies around there. Does all of this, what you've laid out, at all excuse or put into perspective, or I mean, it's different things, or even justify to you Russia's invasion of Ukraine? And how do you see that Russia itself and its invasion in Ukraine?
Well, I think it puts it in perspective. Certainly, if the Kremlin would have emailed or called me before February 24th, 2022, I would have advised them not to intervene in Ukraine. But for whatever reason, they did not contact me. So I was not able to convey that message, because I do think that there is a danger in Russia as well that I have not mentioned thus far. The danger is, number one, all of this loose talk about a no-fly zone, which was the topic of choice on the Sunday morning talk shows about 48 hours ago in the United States of America, with the chat show hosts on Face the Nation and This Week on ABC and Meet the Press, all pressing administration spokespersons from the right concerning implementing a no-fly zone, which of course has been endorsed by some of the Baltic states leadership, has been suggested by some of the leadership in Kiev, Ukraine as well. Obviously, setting aside the danger of a dogfight between Russian jets and NATO jets erupting over the Ukrainian landmass, which could then, as Mr. Biden has said accurately, could lead to World War III. And that would not only be disastrous for the United States of America and the NATO countries, it would be disastrous for Russia as well. However, you mentioned the NATO enlargement, which was one of the triggers concerning this crisis that we're now embroiled in. It's interesting to note that once again, on This Week with ABC a few days ago, President Zelensky said that he had, quote, cooled off, unquote, with regard to NATO enlargement. I assume that means that he's willing to take that off the table, that he's willing to take Ukraine's membership in NATO off the table, which I guess we can say better late than never. There are also hints that the Kiev leadership is willing to negotiate about the Donbass, these regions that are in the east of Ukraine that Russia is charging. There have been thousands of deaths, a banning of Russian language, instruction, and all the rest. And hopefully that leaves room for de-escalation and negotiation. And in that regard, I would like to point to the fact that President Ramaphosa of South Africa, which is allied with Brazil, Russia, China, and India, and the so-called BRICS, has offered his good offices concerning being a mediator. This is the man who was at the point when the apartheid rulers were forced to hold democratic elections in 1994. So obviously he has experience, not to mention the fact that the Israeli leadership has been involved in, I guess you could call it a mediation effort informally, concerning the prime minister flying to Moscow for meetings with Putin and being on the phone with the leadership in the Ukraine. And of course, the Turks offered their good offices as well. There was a meeting just a few days ago between the Ukrainian foreign minister and Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister. So those are positive signs and developments, because I think the sooner we can move towards resolving this crisis, the better. Although I must reiterate that however this crisis is resolved, I do think we're going to be faced with a new international situation. I do think, as many in China seem to believe, per the New York Times, that China will be a major beneficiary. And I do think that it will not necessarily be a plus in terms of relations between the North Atlantic bloc and the global South, because even the New York Times reprimanded Denmark for refusing to send vaccines to Bangladesh after Bangladesh voted to abstain on the General Assembly resolution. You may know about the fact that the Prime Minister Khan of Pakistan was up in arms after he was rebuked by European Union diplomats in Islamabad, not to mention the United States, after his nation abstained. And of course, he was in Moscow just before February 24th, inking new deals with Moscow that he pledges to go forward with. And so I think that there's going to have to be a lot of mending by the North Atlantic bloc with regard to the global South, no matter how this crisis eventuates.
Ukraine and NATO certainly would not give Russia guarantees that in the future Ukraine would never become a member of NATO. It did not appear as though Ukraine was on the verge of becoming a member of NATO anytime soon. And then, of course, most countries, or not most countries, but many countries around the world have their own internal conflicts that are occurring right now as well. What's happening in the Donbass isn't necessarily unusual, globally speaking, in history. Is that, I mean, do you not, Russia's invasion, Russia invaded a sovereign nation. What was it justified in doing that?
Well, as I said, if they had contacted me before this intervention, I would have counseled against it. But at the same time, I have not had the experience of seeing Ukraine as a highway for German tanks plowing in to Russia, the then Soviet Union, post June 22nd, 1941, with Operation Barbarossa. I do not have the kind of emotional baggage that is obviously present in Russia when they see the Azov battalions, these neo-Nazis. Now, it's one thing to say that they're neo-Nazis in the United States as well, and they're neo-Nazis in Germany. It's another thing to see neo-Nazis being quite close to certain influential leaders in Kiev. And it's not enough to say that President Zelensky is Jewish. That's like saying, well, President Obama is Black, and so therefore you can dismiss anti-Black racism between 2008 and 2016. That barely passes the giggle test.
But you couldn't say that the KKK had control of the presidency and of the state apparatus under Obama. You probably couldn't say that the Nazis had control of the state apparatus in Ukraine either.
Well, I did not use the term control. I think I used the term influence. And it's a, I mean,
but I mean, there's a difference, right? I mean, yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that Nazis had been incorporated into the armed forces, as you mentioned, the Azov battalion. But it doesn't mean that it was taking over the state apparatus.
Well, sure, but I guess Moscow then has to wonder, well, where does this process end? I mean, it's one thing to be a fringe group and being viewed as such. It's another thing to being incorporated into the state apparatus to a degree, not to mention the salutations to Mr. Bandera and other disgraced, or what I would call disgraced figures from the period between 1941 and 1945, whom some in Ukraine tend to view as heroes. It's apparent that when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which came into existence on an anti-Soviet basis in 1949, should have collapsed as well, particularly since the Warsaw Pact, with which it had crossed swords, led by the then Soviet Union, also retreated. But instead, what happened is that former Warsaw Pact members were incorporated into NATO, including members incorporated into NATO who were just provinces before that, speaking of former Yugoslav provinces, such as Montenegro and North Macedonia, for example. And then Moscow has to wonder, well, what is the purpose? I think to a certain extent, the most charitable point you can make about incorporation of these new states into NATO post-1991, with it virtually doubling its membership during that time, the best point, it seems to me, that could be made is that NATO was basically bluffing, that it just saw this as an opportunity for these states to devote their treasury to pumping up the share price of Raytheon and Lockheed Martin, and that they had no malign or malignant intentions with regard to invading Moscow or engaging in what's in the air right now in Washington, which is regime change. Senator Lindsey Graham, as you know, has talked about assassination of Mr. Putin. Certainly, regime change is something that has not been taken off the table by certain influential figures in Washington. And so I think that NATO miscalculated, Ukraine miscalculated, and it may, at the end of the day, seem, depending on what happens when the dust settles, it may seem that Moscow miscalculated.
This is Letters and Politics, and we are in conversation with Gerald Horne. Gerald Horne holds the Moores Professorship of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's the author of a number of books, and he also has a piece out at the Black Agenda report called From Crisis to Catastrophe: What is to be Done in Eastern Europe. The reason I'm harping on this issue here concerning the legitimacy of what Russia has done, because it seems to me this isn't new. In fact, maybe we could trace this all the way back to the Communist Party in the 1930s, the fallout between Trotsky and Stalin. It seems like nothing splits the left quite like when Russia and the United States combat each other around the global stage. And I definitely hear what you're saying, and I've heard from people, and we've talked to other people who have said, similar things to what you are saying now. But then there's another side to it that you also find on the left that say, well, if we're pro-peace and anti-imperialist, then we should be consistent in that. It's wrong for the United States to do it. It's also wrong for Russia to do it. And I'm not saying this is your argument, but if we were to point out the reasons why Russia did it, couldn't then you look at the war on terrorism in the United States? It was traumatized by the 9/11 attacks. And I know we can get into a much bigger, historical, and this isn't my argument either, but somebody else could make the same kind of arguments that the United States had an interest for what it did in its war on terrorism if we went down the same line of thinking.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the U.S. left, because that's part of the piece that you referenced in the Black Agenda report. Because even though some may have forgotten, I'm old enough to remember a time when many of our friends on the U.S. left were suggesting that once the Soviet Union was collapsed, once the Communist Party was ousted from power, then presumably the U.S. left would have this so-called albatross removed from around its neck, and we would see the flourishing of the U.S. left as a direct result. Instead, we see that in countries like France, for example, having a presidential election within days, During the Cold War, you had very strong socialist and communist parties in France. But as we approach French elections, the contest seems to be between President Macron of the center right and others to his right. Eric Zemmour, the chat show host on the French version of Fox News, Marine Le Pen of the erstwhile neo-Nazi party, etc. And it's the same throughout the capitalist world. I mean, look at Italy, for example, which during the Cold War, the Communist Party of Italy was a very strong party. And now, of course, you have the Five Star Movement. You have these right-wing populists. Look at the United States, for example, where we're facing the grim prospect not only of a Republican takeover of the House and Senate in November, and they already control the Supreme Court, perhaps a return to power by Agent Orange himself, Donald J. Trump, in 2024, 2025. Look at India, where during the Cold War, you not only had a Congress party, which was close to the left, but now it's ruled by anti-Muslim Hindu chauvinists, for example. So it seems to me that what we actually should be discussing, amongst other points, is how the U.S. left got, at least a segment of the U.S. left, got things so wrong. And not only that, but when are they going to engage in a bit of old-fashioned self-criticism, which may be illuminating in terms of helping us to dig ourselves out of this present crisis? Because I think that, as I mentioned a moment or two ago, one of the points that should rivet the attention of many in this multiracial country is the fact that this Eastern European crisis has obviously galvanized, once again, the pan-European world. It has led to sanctions, at least in the formal sense, by virtually every European country and every North Atlantic country, including the United States and Canada. But with the kind of disconnect, as I've already mentioned, elsewhere in the world, with, I think, domestic ramifications and repercussions for the United States, which, as I'm sure your listeners know, has more than its share, shall we say, of citizenry who are not from the pan-European world. This could cause rifts within the U.S. left, which at least in the putative sense is multiracial and multi-ethnic. And so I think that those are questions that we need to plumb. I think that the U.S. left has many permutations. And as noted, one of the questions that should be asked of the U.S. left is how so many of them got it wrong during the Cold War. I mean, many of them were supporting these anti-communist trade unions in Warsaw, who are now in power and are now, of course, having their agents bash African refugees in the head as they seek refuge in Poland. I mean, shouldn't there be some sort of responsibility for that kind of crisis as well?
There's no question in my mind that the United States has been the biggest imperial power since the fall of the Soviet Union, maybe before then, maybe since World War II, and has caused havoc that hasn't been matched by anyone else around the world. That said, is it a contradiction to condemn U.S. action in the world, not necessarily condemn the same way Russia's invasion into Ukraine, when Ukraine certainly wasn't on the verge of attacking Russia?
I think our primary responsibility is to try to rein in this imperial power with headquarters in Washington and on Wall Street. I think that if we rein in that power, for example, if we had been successful in reining in that power, there would have been no crisis in Ukraine in the first instance, because there would not have been pressure for Ukraine to join NATO. I think for those comrades who see it necessary to castigate Moscow, I have no objection to their castigations and denunciations. However, I should warn them to be careful with who they're sharing a trench with. Be careful with who you're sharing a foxhole with. Because, as I said, right now, there's a lot of momentum in the United States, perhaps unintentionally, perhaps not, towards World War III, quite frankly, towards ratcheting up tensions with Moscow. I'm not sure if left-wing forces contributing to that kind of hysteria will be helpful in terms of trying to de-escalate this crisis, leading to fruitful negotiations. That's my concern. Everything has to be contextualized. Everything has to be of the moment. This crisis is not existing in a vacuum. And it's gotten to the point now where, quite frankly, like others, I've begun to speculate as to what a nuclear exchange would look like between NATO and Russia. And when things have moved to that level, it's apparent that I'm not sure if we need any left-wing cheerleaders with regard to Putin bashing or with regard to Russian bashing, because I don't think that would be very helpful in terms of de-escalation.
It seems to me, historically speaking, again, as I said earlier, there's nothing that seems to split the left in the United States and maybe globally quite like relations between the United States and Russia. You're the historian. Do you think that's accurate?
Well, yeah, I think it has something to do with the point I introduced at the top, which is that the fly in the ointment then, speaking of Tsarist times, during Soviet times and post-Soviet times, the fly in the ointment with regard to pan-European unity has been Russia. Because, as noted, when the Western European nations, recall that even Sweden tried to develop a colony in the Delaware Valley, for example, in the Philadelphia area, you had Denmark controlling what we now refer to as the Virgin Islands for the longest period. Russia was moving east, oftentimes at the expense of China and other Asian nations, only establishing its window on the Pacific, speaking of Vladivostok, in 1860. And so, to a certain degree, I think our friends on the left who get split on this question of Russia, as you have articulated and suggested, may need to consider that Russia, for various historical reasons, has not been part of the British, French, Portuguese, Spanish-led pillaging and plundering of Africa and of the Americas. And that has created a rift within the pan-European world that may be manifested in the US left, which is heavily of European descent. I mean, I think that that's the kind of avenue that needs to be explored. And certainly, as I pointed out in a number of books, if you look at Black intellectuals, for example, in the 20th century, W.E.B. Du Bois, Paul Robeson, Shirley Graham Du Bois, Claudia Jones, Ferdinand Smith, they were not as wound up or as exercised by some of their Euro-American counterparts with regard to the Soviet experience. In fact, as you know, Paul Robeson was quite close to the Soviet Union during some of the darkest days of the Cold War. The same could be said for W.E.B. Du Bois. When you had a split in the U.S. Communist Party post-1956, much of it generated by revelations concerning Joseph Stalin, the Soviet leader from the 1920s to 1953, and the intervention in Budapest, Hungary during that same year, 1956, the Black comrades were less likely to desert the ranks of the U.S. Communist Party, which remained close to Moscow, than some of the Euro-American comrades. Now, so I think that when we speak about the rifts in the U.S. left, we should be clear that a lot of these rifts are really being generated and being manifested in the Euro-American left, more so than the multiracial left, which is a better characterization of the left in the United States.
I've always, in my view of this, maybe very simplistic, I've kind of seen the split, again, going back to the split between Joseph Stalin and Leon Trotsky, and that what would end up happening, of course, Stalin ends up running the Soviet Union, or is at the head of the Soviet Union, becomes a very authoritarian figure, a brutal figure in of his own right. And then this created a dynamic, and who were you going to be with? Those who went with Trotsky were kind of like, well, whether if it's the Soviet Union that's acting in a totalitarian way, or if it's the United States acting as an imperial power, both of them are wrong. Whereas others would say, well, the socialist Soviet experiment was important, and we should still back the Soviet Union because the imperialism of the United States is just overwhelmingly bad, and that's the side we should take. I guess that's how I kind of seen the genesis of the split. But again, I'm not a historian, and and I'm sure it's an oversimplistic view. But what are your thoughts?
Well, once again, I think it has something to do with what your priorities are. What I mean is that for those, I mentioned a moment ago about how I don't carry the emotional baggage of the siege of Leningrad, 900 days, where people were reduced to eating shoe leather, for example. I don't carry the emotional baggage of being witness to the plains of Europe and the plains of Ukraine being used as a highway to invade Russia. But I do carry the emotional baggage of being a child of the African slave trade. I do carry the emotional baggage of being a son of Africa and being quite conversant with the depredations inflicted upon the African continent by not only the United States' closest allies, speaking of Britain and Portugal and France in the first instance, but by the United States itself. And I am aware of the fact, because I've written books about it, about how that entire horrible historical process was short-circuited, not least because of assistance from the socialist camp, from Moscow, from the Soviet Union and its allies. And of course, we still have a legacy of that experience today with regard to these African students who, of course, I just mentioned are being roughhoused and manhandled in Ukraine and Poland as we speak. And so that's my perspective. That is to say, I mentioned a moment ago that folks who are protesting, they should be careful with whom they share a foxhole and whom they share a trench, because they may wind up being accidentally and unintentionally being used to whip up a kind of hysteria that leads to World War III. And likewise, I'm very conscious and intentional with regard to whom I should share a foxhole with. And I would not want to necessarily be found on the same side as my antagonists, my historical antagonists and my contemporary antagonists, but would like to be found on the side of the opponents of my antagonists.
Is that the enemy of my enemy is my friend?
Well, in part, but it's also a question of solidarity. It's also a question of working class solidarity. That is to say that is a concept that has gone out of fashion, I'm afraid to say it, in recent decades, but obviously needs to be revived and resuscitated. And to conclude where we began, I think that in terms of this present crisis that we're facing, it should give us a new perspective on the entire Cold War experience, which is how I began that article referenced in the Black Agenda report, because the Cold War, it seems to me, was a catastrophic victory for U.S. imperialism. It was a victory, no doubt. It led to decades of unipolarity, for example. But it was catastrophic because in order to execute this victory, and this is once again something I think the US left needs to chew on, because when they oftentimes discuss the collapse of the social experiment in Eastern Europe, they tend to see it almost solely and exclusively as a result of internal contradictions and disregarding the external factors being A, the U.S. alliance with religious zealotry in Afghanistan, which of course backfired on September 11, 2001. B, what was being marked just before February 24th, 2022. That is to say, the 50th anniversary of the U.S. entente with the People's Republic of China, whereby Nixon and Mao Zedong embrace, shake hands, clink glasses, which on the one hand leads to massive foreign direct investment in China, creating this juggernaut, which bids fair to leave U.S. imperialism sprawling in the dust. And as I suggested a moment or two ago, helps to shed light on the present crisis in the Ukraine, because ultimately I think the target is the People's Republic of China, which the United States helped to create in terms of its present muscular nature. But at the same time, of course, China, they also contributed, I'm afraid to say, to U.S. imperialism. They waged war on Vietnam after the United States was ousted post 1975. In the run-up to the 1972 meeting between Nixon and Mao, China waged war on India in 1962 under the shadow of the Cuban Missile Crisis, for example. In my book on Southern Africa, I talked about their curious relationships in Southern Africa with certain forces that were all too close to apartheid Pretoria, et cetera. So I think that rather than risking nuclear war to try to reverse the results of this ill-fated entente with China 50 years ago, I think that not only should Washington be engaged in self-criticism, but also we all know that many of our friends on the left, speaking of our friends on the left, were also quite supportive of this Mao-Nixon entente, which, of course, once again, has not been subjected to self-criticism in the least.
You've mentioned the historic relationship between the Soviet Union and the global South. During the Cold War, during the time of the Soviet Union, did it also, in its presence in the global South, try to enrich itself the way that Western powers did?
There's really no comparison. I mean, there's no comparison between Moscow arming the Cubans to defeat the apartheid army on the battlefield of southern Angola and northern Namibia, with U.S. corporations looting Namibia of uranium and looting Angola of petroleum vis-a-vis the now hardly discussed corporation Gulf Oil, which was heavily involved in Angola. And, it's interesting today that China is oftentimes being accused of the same sorts of depredations in Africa that have been affixed to U.S. imperialism. Once again, I think that that's an exaggeration at best. I think that many African leaders are happy with the fact that there is now a counterweight to North Atlantic imperialism on the African continent in the person of the People's Republic of China. And it's interesting that I think that many people in the United States, they take a very paternalistic view of African leaders, is that they don't know how to negotiate, they don't know how to fend for themselves, and so they have to depend upon these armchair quarterbacks in the United States to give them guidance as to how to navigate and negotiate with the People's Republic of China. I'm not sure if the world works like that. And I think that also helps to explain, once again, why there were so many abstentions in the General Assembly concerning the vote on censuring Russia for the intervention in Ukraine, because not only, as noted, the African leaders are concerned about there being this double standard. how the North Atlantic countries can do whatever they want, whenever they want. And they feel that that would not be a step forward in terms of international relations, not to mention the fact that they not only welcome fruitful bilateral relations with Russia and China and Turkey, which, by the way, is playing an ever increasing role on the African continent, with India, ditto, etc.
Does it matter that Russia is no longer, obviously, the Soviet Union, no longer a socialist state? Has its involvement in the world shifted? I mean, I imagine it's not as involved as it once was, especially in the global South, but has its priorities shifted since the days of the Soviet Union?
Well, sure. I mean, and that's another point, because this is not the first time that there has been a contestation between non-socialist powers. For example, during World War II, there was a contestation and confrontation between Imperial Tokyo and Imperial London in Hong Kong, Singapore, and elsewhere. And many on the left had no problem, had no compunction with siding with London vis-a-vis Tokyo. And they did not necessarily say, well, a plague on both their houses. Both are imperialists, both are capitalists, so we're sitting this one out. In their, quote, wisdom, unquote, they decided that the better option was to side with London. Now, that decision, for whatever reason, has not been interrogated. But in any case, in some sense, we see a replay on the plains of Europe as we speak, with two major non-socialist blocs confronting each other. That is to say, Russia on the one hand, and the United States and its allies on the other. And certainly, with regard to Africa, there is a difference between Moscow 1917 to 1991 and Moscow 1991 to 2022. But having said that, I think that the African countries are sufficiently aware to realize that there is a counterweight that is required and needed with regard to confronting the depredations that are routinely inflicted upon the African continent by the North Atlantic powers.
Dr. Gerald Horne has been our guest. Again, Dr. Horne holds the Moores Professorship of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's the author of dozens of books, and he has a new piece out that you can find on the website of Black Agenda Report. It's called From Crisis to Catastrophe: What is to be Done in Eastern Europe. Professor Horne, thank you for your time.
Thank you for inviting me.